Okay, welcome back to part two of the lecture on photography. So when we last left off, we were talking about Lewis Hine, and I was talking about how um, the rest of this lecture is going to be kind of grouped around different artists and different ideas as to what is the goal, what is the purpose of photography, how is photography distinct from other art media. And so Lewis Hine is a good example of an artist who really kind of focuses on the documentary impulse of photography, the idea that the main thing that a camera and art made with a camera can do that other arts can't is it can see the world accurately right there in the moment. It doesn't require setups, it doesn't require models posing and taking lots of time. You can just document the reality of that moment right there in front of you. We've seen this a little bit hinted at in both the work of Steichen and Stieglitz, although they both also had a more kind of more artistic and more romantic kind of ideas that they were interested in as well in their work. But Hine very much, partially because he came into photography through um, through social activism. It, he wasn't a photographer first. He was a writer and a someone who was interested in child labor issues and um, you know industry safety issues and workers' rights. And he was sent by various organizations to document child labor abuses and worker abuses. And it was through that he became a photographer. So his passion was the stories he wanted to tell first and the photography second. And we see in someone like Robert Capa also kind of an interest in photography being about a kind of a completely objective and unfiltered eye into the world, not a instead of kind of like telling a story, just looking and seeing. And he will be one of many photographers that we will look at who documented the many wars of the 20th century. But we have other artists who took very different approaches. Man Ray, who was a surrealist and was, influenced by artists in the Dada, was very much viewed viewed photography as a scientific media that could be explored and as kind of an experimental type of activity that could be kind of like almost like a form of alchemy that could be played with to just kind of create various different effects. And he was very much interested in making things that were purely kind of like a product of the science of playing with the materials. And after things that were not about objective reality, but just about the play and the juxtaposition. Somewhere like Edward Weston had a very different approach about what was the purpose of photography. His approach was to view photography as primarily about finding finding abstraction in the visible world. And so looking for the things that he wanted to document, but trying to find ways to emphasize their pure formal and pure abstract qualities. So looking for them as sources of shape and of line. Um, by the way, in this whole lecture, I'm probably going to have very few artworks actually notated with the title and the artist and the date. Um, I just did a few of them, mostly the ones that we have seen in other lectures where they might happen to be on a test, but for most of the part, I'm just going to leave them just with the name of the artist up at the top, and that's going to be all the identification we're going to have. So Cartier-Bresson had a slightly different interpretation as to the role of photography. It was somewhat of a um, related to those who viewed photography as being about documentation, but it was also very much for him, about design. And what he searched for was what he called the decisive moment. He looked for photographs to kind of capture a single moment where everything comes together. The what he wants to say and all the design elements that he wants to put together. And so I think like this photograph here with the bicycles just kind of sums up exactly his kind of approach to photography, where It is, in a way, just kind of an everyday snapshot of life, and yet at the same time, it's a very, very carefully composed arrangement of design decisions. Um, and so, but at the same time, he had to wait there, you know, I don't know how long, but for that moment to happen. And for him, that was the most important part of photography. The idea that other types of art form, you know, aren't dependent on a single moment, whereas a camera, by its very nature, is about a single moment. So here we have some other photographers who were more interested, like did more work on the commercial side, and I want to talk a little bit about how commercial photography started to become more and more an important part of photography, and um, really kind of was a major part of the push in photography towards higher and higher quality. The commercial photographers really aiming for, like Josef Karsh was aiming for these really, really rich, dense portrait photographs, dense in terms of like the amount of information in all of these different changes of values. And in order to get that, he had to really become a master craftsman. And so that really pushed the whole field of photography in strong directions. We also see that in someone like Richard Avedon and Irving Penn. And but no one pushed an understanding of the craft of photography more, I would say, than Ansel Adams. Ansel Adams is still today pretty much revered as the the photographer who valued the craft of the print, the craft of the exposure, and the craft of the thoughtful thinking about photography as an organization of values. Ansel Adams only took black and white photography, and I mean, one of the things that is, here's a way to think about it, right? That if you or I took a normal photograph, think about how many nameable grays we could find in our photograph. Hold on, where's my cursor? There it is. Like how many, you know, if we took a photograph of this scene right here, how many different values could we find in there? And then really think about how even in these some of these rich, rich dark areas, how Ansel Adams is still managing to find changes of value, but at the same time holding this overall organization of the light areas and the dark areas. That careful thought about how to get the absolute perfect exposure with the richest amount of information was kind of the obsession of Ansel Adams. Um, and it was, in a way, it was like, so his kind of idea of what photography was an obsession with the craft of photography, the craft of getting the absolute perfect exposure and the absolute perfect print. It was a love of photography out in the world and a love of the science of the darkroom. He was such an extraordinary artist. But by the 60s, Ansel Adams' definition of what photography should be about was starting to become a little bit irrelevant because there were young artists coming along who had a very different idea of what the role of photography was. And so next we're going to be looking at some kind of these artists who are sort of making this transition between um, the end of modernism into the beginning of postmodernism. And so we'll start with Diane Arbus. And I would say that Arbus's her argument is that photography, by being such an informal media and something that can document so easily, so quickly, so instantaneously. Hold on a second, we're about to get to my 1 minute mark. That because of those things, photography was a means of documenting a person's internal world, their personal world, and their the internal thoughts, but also documenting a little bit of the world around us. And she loved the idea of photography being this kind of democratic art form that allowed the strangest and the most oddball people in the world to be represented and to be seen. All right, I will get back to you with part 3 in just a second.